Experts couldn't fix a complex ship engine, not until the Admiral brought a black, brilliant Navy veteran. Before we continue, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel as we dish out fresh, engaging stories daily. Enjoy the story. The engine of one of the Navy's most advanced warships, a vessel critical to an unfolding mission, failed just days before deployment. Alarms rang, teams scrambled, diagnostics were run, every sensor double-checked, every system torn down to its core. Nothing worked. The countdown was ticking. The mission, and perhaps something far bigger, hung by a thread. Just when the last engineer threw up his hands and the base began preparing for the worst, someone, almost reluctantly, mentioned a name not heard in years. A name the Navy once buried under silence. A name attached to both brilliance and disgrace. Malcolm Reyes. When he walked into the maintenance bay, wearing grease-stained coveralls and holding nothing more than a worn brass listening rod, the room fell quiet. Some scoffed. Others stared. But no one truly understood what he had come to do. Because Malcolm wasn't just there to diagnose a turbine failure. He wasn't just there to patch up a warship and disappear back into the shadows. He was there to confront the past. To fix something far more complex than machinery. His reputation. And what happened next would challenge everything they thought they knew about experience, instinct, and redemption. The tin roof creaked above as the southern heat pressed down on the bayou, turning the air inside the shed into a slow-cooked haze. Outside, Spanish moss clung to cypress branches like drapes in a forgotten chapel. Inside, the world was quieter, steadier. Tools hung from the walls in perfect alignment. Coffee cans full of bolts and spark plugs stood on a weather-warped bench. A transistor radio played faint jazz in the corner, the static humming like the voice of time itself. Malcolm Reyes stood over an old two-stroke fishing boat engine, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hands coated in oil and memory. His skin was leathery, his frame wiry, but his movements were steady and sure. Each turn of the wrench was deliberate, thoughtful, as if he were conducting a symphony only he could hear. He hadn't worn a Navy uniform in over a decade, but remnants of it lived everywhere in that shed. A faded patch reading, U.S. Navy, Propulsion Division, a rusted plaque from the USS Meridian, a framed photograph of a younger Malcolm standing proud beside a destroyer. There was no ceremony in his exile. One engine failure during a routine training run, and just like that, he became the fall guy. It didn't matter that the investigation had been rushed or that the system preferred scapegoats to second chances. They said it was human error. His error. And that was the end of it. So Malcolm returned to Thibodeau. To the marshes and the moss, the quiet and the work. He fixed engines for fishermen who paid in crumpled bills and fresh catfish. And though he never spoke of the Navy, there were nights when he'd sit out back with a tin cup of bourbon, staring into the stars, wondering if maybe somewhere, someone remembered the truth. The radio crackled louder for a moment, but Malcolm didn't notice. He was deep into calibrating the carburetor when it happened. The shrill ring of the landline jolted the air like thunder. No one called that phone anymore. It hadn't rung in weeks, maybe months. Malcolm wiped his hands on a rag and stared at it for a moment, unsure whether to answer. But something in his gut told him this wasn't a wrong number. He picked it up. Reyes speaking. There was a beat of silence. Then a voice he hadn't heard in 15 years. Malcolm. It's Henry Caldwell. The room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped a little, or maybe Malcolm just imagined it. Caldwell, he said slowly. Well, I'll be damned. I don't have time for small talk, the Admiral replied, his tone tight. I wish this call was different, old friend. But we've got a problem. Malcolm leaned against the workbench, his instincts already shifting into gear. Go on. The USS Vincennes, Caldwell said. She's sitting dead in the water at dock. Brand new retrofit. Engines were tested, certified. Then yesterday, full system shut down. 5 engineering teams have gone through her. Nothing. She's got to sail in 3 days. That's not long, Malcolm murmured. It's not, Caldwell agreed. And the mission isn't public, but let's just say it's more than a show of force. We can't delay. We can't fail. And you think I'm your Hail Mary, Malcolm said, not bitter, just observant. You built the Vincennes Propulsion Foundation when it was still blueprints, Caldwell said. No one else knows her the way you do. I know we failed you before, but I'm asking. Malcolm stared at the engine on his bench. A simple thing, really. Just pistons and grit. Unlike the turbines he used to command, machines that could eat storms and sprint through oceans. But this small one still gave him peace. Purpose. You do realize, Malcolm said after a pause. I haven't touched a ship engine since they sent me packing. And yet, Caldwell said softly, you're still the best. Silence hung on the line, broken only by the jazz fading into static. I'll need clearance, Malcolm said finally. Already being processed, Caldwell answered. We'll send a vehicle. Tonight. Malcolm hung up the phone without goodbye. He looked around the shed, at the old radio, the rusted parts, the life he'd built from rejection. Then he grabbed his toolbox, the same one he'd carried aboard the Meridian, the Lennox, and the Liberty-class trials before everything went wrong. Outside, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and rust, stretching long shadows over the bayou water. A Navy Jeep rumbled in the distance, headlights piercing through the hanging moss. Malcolm didn't move right away. He stood in the doorway of his shed, the weight of the past pressing down, the possibility of redemption just ahead. The forgotten genius was being called back. And this time, the machine wasn't the only thing that needed fixing. The military helicopter dipped low through the misty Virginia sky, slicing through banks of fog that hung over the Atlantic like breath held too long. Below, the sprawl of Naval Base Norfolk came into view, gray ships lined up like steel giants sleeping in the dockyard. Warehouses, cranes, rows of fuel trucks, and flickers of movement everywhere, technicians, officers, Marines, each part of a vast, living organism engineered for precision and power. Malcolm Reyes sat in the back of the chopper, a duffel bag by his side and his old brass listening rod strapped carefully in a worn leather sling. He hadn't stepped foot on this base in nearly 15 years. His last departure was through the back gate, with a manila envelope in one hand and silence in the other. No handshakes. No ceremony. Just the quiet removal of someone they no longer wanted. Now, they needed him again. As the bird touched down near the intermediate maintenance facility, Malcolm stood and stretched the stiffness from his knees. The pilot, barely in his 30s, gave a sideways glance but said nothing. Malcolm stepped out into the wet wind, boots landing on soaked concrete, his breath misting in the cold morning air. A jeep idled nearby, flanked by two officers. One stepped forward, a lean, clean-cut man in his 40s with a polished uniform and the eyes of someone used to being listened to. He extended a hand. Chief Engineer Russell Myers. Admiral Caldwell asked me to escort you in. Malcolm took the hand briefly. Reyes. Myers gestured toward the building. Let's get you inside. The team's already assembled. Inside the facility, the space buzzed with tension. High ceilings stretched into the shadows above, filled with gantries, cranes, and humming lights. Rows of turbines, jet housings, and massive metallic components lined the floor like artifacts from a mechanical age. The air smelled of oil, metal, and discipline. Malcolm walked slowly, absorbing the scene. The USS Vincennes, or at least the heart of her, sat exposed on a reinforced steel platform. The LM-2600 turbine engine, gleaming, wounded, and silent. Its cowling had been stripped, internal stages pulled open like the chest of a fallen titan. A cluster of young engineers stood around a digital workstation. Crisp uniforms, shining boots, touchscreens in hand. They looked up as Malcolm approached, some with open curiosity, others with subtle smirks of disbelief. One whispered to another. Malcolm didn't need to hear it to know what they were saying. That's the guy? That's who they called in? Myers motioned to the group. This is Mr. Malcolm Reyes. He's one of the original consultants on this engine class. He's here under Admiral Caldwell's authority. There was a beat of silence. Gentlemen, Malcolm said, nodding once. Then he walked straight to the engine like he already knew its secrets. His eyes scanned the exposed rotors, the compressor blades, the lines of the fuel manifold. Everything was too clean, too textbook, like a body prepped for burial. Myers caught up. We've run every diagnostic. Checked for salt damage, particulate wear, irregular combustion. We've replaced filters, recalibrated the intake cycle, even ran a multi-vector vibration scan. The engine still shuts down after 90 seconds of operation. Malcolm said nothing. He reached into his bag, pulling out a cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside was his tool of choice, an old brass listening rod, long as a forearm and polished at both ends from years of use. It gleamed under the fluorescent light like a relic from a forgotten temple. Myers narrowed his eyes. What is that? Malcolm didn't answer. He turned to the nearest technician. Power it up. Idle for 45. Then full throttle. There was hesitation in the room. Mr. Reyes, one of the engineers began. The engine's not rated for that under current conditions. Without controlled monitoring, you want it fixed? Malcolm asked, eyes steady. More hesitation. Then Myers gave a short nod. Run it. Follow his instructions. The crew scattered to stations. Buttons clicked. The platform shuddered slightly as the LM-2600 roared to life, its core pulsing with dormant power. The sound was mechanical thunder, metal breathing after too long in silence. Malcolm stepped forward, placed one end of the brass rod against the turbine casing, and leaned the other end to his ear. He closed his eyes. The room went still. Engineers stopped whispering. Even the whir of computers seemed to dull beneath the turbine's growing roar. 45 seconds passed. Then Malcolm raised one hand, an unspoken command. Throttle up. The engine screamed, pushing toward maximum RPM. The vibration intensified. Lights flickered. Everyone tensed, watching for signs of failure. But Malcolm stood still, listening. At 60 seconds, his brow furrowed. 70. The rod shifted slightly in his hand. His other hand touched the housing, feeling for something only he could sense. 80 seconds. Then 90. He stepped back. Shut it down. The engine powered off in stages, exhaling heat and energy into the cavernous bay. Silence returned, heavy and expectant. Malcolm turned to face the room. It's not fuel, not pressure, not corrosion. He pointed toward the axial stage. The rotor's misaligned. At high RPM, it shifts off center. Harmonic imbalance kicks in at peak load, but it's subtle. Doesn't trip your sensors. Yet, Myers looked confused. But we checked alignment twice. Laser scopes, automated trackers. They missed it, Malcolm said. Because they weren't listening. He tapped the rod against the engine. She's talking. Always has been. You just don't hear her the way I do. One of the junior engineers muttered under his breath. This is absurd. There's no way. Align the shaft, Malcolm said, cutting him off. Check axial and radial tolerances by hand, then rerun your tests. That ship will run. He packed the rod away and turned toward the exit. Myers called after him, unsure what to say. But Malcolm didn't wait for applause or disbelief. He had spoken his truth. As he walked back across the hangar floor, the sounds of machinery resumed around him. But for a moment, just a moment, the engineers stood still. Watching the man who'd walked in with a toolbox, said almost nothing, and diagnosed a mystery no machine could solve. He passed one of the younger men at the door. The kid looked at him with a mix of confusion and quiet awe. How did you hear that? He asked. Malcolm didn't stop walking. Same way I always have, he said, with the part of me that remembers what it sounds like when something's right. And just like that, the old master was gone. Outside, the mist still hung low over the dockyard. But inside, something had shifted. Not just in the engine, but in the room, in the minds of those who had witnessed the impossible. Brass and bone. That's all he needed. And sometimes, that's all it takes to remind the world that even steel listens, if you know how to ask. The light came slowly, spreading across the Atlantic like a whisper. By the time dawn fully arrived at Naval Base Norfolk, the USS Vincennes sat poised in silence, her steel hull catching the pale morning sun. But deep within her, far from the surface shine, something more profound was unfolding. The engine room, cold and tense the day before, now stirred with the quiet urgency of redemption. Chief Engineer Russell Myers stood at the control panel, no longer wearing his usual arrogance. His sleeves were rolled up, jaw tight with focus. Around him, his team moved like a unit, careful, deliberate, but unsure. This was no ordinary morning shift. This was about proving a truth many had dismissed too quickly. Malcolm Reyes' notes lay open beside the main terminal. His rough sketches, drawn by hand, annotated with margin comments that only experience could produce, now served as gospel. The brass listening rod, left behind by request, rested on a nearby workbench, an artifact of an older, more tactile kind of wisdom. Begin laser alignment, Myers ordered, voice low but clear. 2 engineers moved into position, guiding the precision instrument toward the turbine. The LM-2600 had been cracked open, cleaned, realigned, and checked again. Now, with the laser sweeping across its core, the truth could no longer hide. The readings appeared on screen, micrometric discrepancies confirmed. The rotor was indeed misaligned, just as Malcolm had said. There was no joy in the confirmation, only silence. Measurements were taken again, then a third time. Identical. Myers exhaled slowly, his hands on his hips. He didn't speak, but everyone in the room felt it. The tide had turned. Let's run it, he said at last. The turbine roared to life. The vibration sensors flickered briefly, then steadied. No spikes, no irregularities, just a low, even hum, the sound of balance, of precision. of an old man's unshakable instinct. Myers looked up at the observation deck. Behind the glass, Admiral Henry Caldwell watched, arms folded across his chest, a flicker of pride in his eyes. He nodded once, then reached for the phone. Back in Thibodaux, Louisiana, the morning sun painted long golden streaks across the bayou. Malcolm Reyes stood in his shed, wiping down an old carburetor, a small transistor radio murmuring classic jazz in the background. He hadn't slept much, but he didn't look tired, just centered, like someone who had made peace with waiting. The landline rang. He walked over, picked up the receiver with his usual quiet calm. Reyes. On the other end, Chief Engineer Myers' voice came through, softer than before. Different. Sir, he began, and paused. You were right. We ran your procedure, aligned the shaft with the laser. It matched exactly. The engine's running like new. The Vincennes sails at 0600 tomorrow. Malcolm didn't answer right away. His eyes shifted toward the open door, toward the slow-moving water just beyond his dock. A crane lifted in the distance, silhouetted against the sunrise. The marsh birds were already at work, skimming the shallows. It was quiet. Honest. No surprises there, he finally said. Myers cleared his throat, his voice more hesitant now. I just wanted you to hear it from me. Thank you. There was something in those two words, gratitude. Yes, but also humility. The kind of respect earned when youth meets wisdom and realizes its limits. Malcolm hung up the phone gently. He didn't gloat. He didn't pour a drink or sit down in triumph. Instead, he turned back to his workbench, picked up a grease-stained rag, and wiped his tools clean, one by one. Outside, the wind rustled the reeds. The water shimmered with the golden promise of a new day. He stepped out onto the dock, the boards creaking under his boots, and looked out across the bayou. Somewhere far beyond the marsh, a destroyer would soon cut through open waters with steady engines and a clear path. And though the sailors on board might never know his name, the rhythm beneath their feet, the low, perfect hum of power and motion, was his legacy. He stood there for a while, letting the light rise around him. His truth had found its voice. At last, under a sky still thick with morning mist, the bayou stirred to life with the distant sound of rotors. The marsh reeds rustled as the wind picked up, and the tin roof of Malcolm Reyes' old shed gave a tired groan. Leaves scattered across the weather-worn dock as the Navy helicopter descended, sending a spray of mist and grit across the shoreline like a waking spirit. The chopper didn't land with fanfare, only purpose. Malcolm stood at the edge of the dock, still as a statue, watching the silhouette take shape through the veil of fog. His toolbox sat beside him, worn and scarred, and inside it, his trusted brass listening rod. The aircraft settled with a controlled thump, the side door sliding open with a hiss. A young lieutenant stepped out clean-cut, barely older than the wrench in Malcolm's pocket. The officer approached, his demeanor respectful, but hesitant. "Mr. Reyes," the lieutenant said, raising his voice over the fading blades. "Admiral Caldwell has asked that you accompany me back to Norfolk." Malcolm didn't reply at first. He looked back toward the shed behind him, the place where he had built a life out of exile. The place where machines spoke and he listened. Then, without a word, he picked up his toolbox, stepped into the helicopter, and didn't look back. The ride was quiet. Below them, the winding fingers of the bayou slipped away into marsh and sea. By the time the skyline of Naval Base Norfolk came into view, the fog had begun to thin, giving way to gray light and the steel bones of the fleet. Warships stood moored like sleeping giants, the base humming with motion and discipline. It had been over 15 years since Malcolm last set foot here, and yet, something about the air still smelled familiar: salt, diesel, and distant urgency. The helicopter touched down near the intermediate maintenance facility, the same one he'd walked into days earlier under a cloud of skepticism. But this time, the atmosphere was different. A row of officers stood waiting, not stiff with suspicion, but standing straight with purpose. Their uniforms were pressed, their expressions neutral but unmistakably respectful. Malcolm stepped off the chopper, back straight, toolbox in hand. His boots struck the concrete with calm certainty. As he approached the group, Admiral Henry Caldwell stepped forward. His eyes met Malcolm's, not with guilt, but with the weight of acknowledgement. "Welcome back," Malcolm, Caldwell said, extending a hand. Malcolm accepted it. "Admiral, we should have done this a long time ago," Caldwell said under his breath. "But we're doing it now." He turned to the group gathered around, the engineering team, administrative staff, and technicians, including Chief Engineer Russell Myers, who stood at the edge of the crowd, noticeably subdued. Caldwell raised his voice. We're here today not to discuss a mission's success, but to correct a failure, one not of machines, but of judgment. 15 years ago, this institution wrongly held Malcolm Reyes responsible for a turbine malfunction aboard a Liberty-class ship. We buried his career under assumptions and let time do the rest. But when the Vincennes failed, and every modern method failed with her, we had only one name left to call. And when he answered that call, he saved this operation. From his breast pocket, Caldwell pulled a small white envelope with the Navy seal embossed in gold. "This is a formal letter of apology and recognition," Caldwell said. "It acknowledges your contributions to our propulsion systems, clears your name of any wrongdoing, and amends your record accordingly." He held it out. Malcolm took it slowly. He didn't open it, just looked at it for a moment, as if weighing not the paper but the years it represented. Then he nodded once and slid it into his pocket. A second envelope followed, plain, unmarked. "Your consulting compensation," Caldwell said. "It won't make up for the time you lost, but it's yours." Malcolm took that, too, with the same quiet dignity. No thanks, no protest. Just the silent understanding that truth, long delayed, had finally arrived. Myers stepped forward, clearing his throat. Gone was the arrogance. In its place, humility and something deeper. "Mr. Reyes," he said, "I was one of the first to doubt you. I looked at your tools and your age and saw a man past his prime. But I watched you walk into that bay and solve something 5 teams of engineers couldn't even understand. You didn't just fix a turbine. You taught us something we forgot." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You reminded us that the old ways still matter." Malcolm looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Machines don't lie," he said. "Sometimes people just stop listening." Myers gave a respectful smile and stepped back. Caldwell addressed the group again. "Let this be more than a correction. Let it be a reminder to all of us that experience is not outdated, that knowledge doesn't rust, and that the people we cast aside often carry the wisdom we need most." There was no applause, no medals pinned, just a collective silence filled with gravity and grace. And that, Malcolm thought, was enough. Later that day, Malcolm sat by the window in a quiet lounge near the docks. A cup of black coffee steamed in front of him. Outside, the USS Vincennes sat humming at full power, preparing to deploy. Her engines purred, clean, aligned, alive. He watched her without sentimentality, only the calm certainty that her heart now beat as it should. The team had done the final checks. The realignment worked. The vibrations were gone. A junior officer walked past and paused at the table. "Sir," he said shyly, "I just wanted to say, I read your old field reports. They should have never." Malcolm raised a hand gently. "What's done is done, son. What matters is what you do next." The officer nodded and left. Caldwell joined him for a moment, handing over a thin folder. "We had your status restored," the Admiral said. "Technically, you retired with full honors now." Malcolm smiled faintly. "Paper never mattered much to me." "No," Caldwell said, "but justice does." Malcolm looked back out the window, where the destroyer pulled slowly away from the dock, cutting through the harbor water with quiet force. In its wake, it carried more than fuel and steel. It carried vindication. And somewhere beneath the engine hum, in the balanced rhythm of metal and motion, Malcolm Reyes heard something only he could truly recognize, the sound of dignity restored. He sipped his coffee. He closed his eyes. And he listened. The morning light broke through the clouds like a secret being whispered between sea and sky. In the distance, the Atlantic shimmered, vast, silver, endless. The rotors of the Navy helicopter thumped rhythmically, rising into the air like a slow, steady drumbeat of departure. Inside, Malcolm Reyes sat still by the window, his body calm, but his eyes alert, tracking the shape of the world below as it shifted and shrank. There, beneath them, the USS Vincennes glided through the channel, its steel hull cutting a confident path toward open water. The destroyer looked almost serene, as if it were unaware of the urgency it had carried just days before. Its twin engines, now fully functional and in perfect harmony, rumbled with the smooth certainty of power restored. Malcolm knew the sound intimately. He had once helped design the heartbeat of that ship, had touched its early schematics, spoken its language in torque, combustion, and balance. That knowledge, long dismissed, almost forgotten, was why the Vincennes now steamed ahead at full power. On board, young sailors moved with discipline and purpose, prepping for deployment. They checked lines, calibrated systems, and secured cargo. Some laughed softly in groups. Others stood alone at the rail, staring out to sea. Not one of them knew the full story of the man rising slowly into the sky above them, the man whose instincts and weathered tools had spared them from delay, or worse. Malcolm didn't expect them to. He didn't need recognition. He never had. He kept his eyes on the ship. Not smiling. Not waving. Just watching. The base fell away beneath the clouds. Hangars shrinking to gray dots, cranes retreating into the haze. The maintenance facility, once cold and tense, was now just a shadow beneath the drifting fog. There would be reports filed, names mentioned, data archived. But none of it would capture the moment Malcolm had leaned forward with a brass rod to his ear, eyes closed, listening not just for vibration, but for truth. That moment, like so much else in his life, would never be recorded properly. And that was fine with him. In his lap, his old toolbox rested quietly. The latch had been repaired with a twist of copper wire. Inside, the brass listening rod lay still, the end smoothed by years of use, the middle darkened with the oil of hundreds of machines. That rod had heard the secrets of engines that computers could not. It had never failed him. It was more than a tool. It was memory, method, and faith made solid. Malcolm glanced at the young pilot in the cockpit, focused, alert, steady. The boy couldn't have been more than 25. His uniform was sharp, his posture disciplined. He'd probably grown up with technology in every room of the house. He probably trusted screens more than silence. Malcolm didn't hold it against him. He leaned back in his seat, arms crossed loosely, his breathing slow. It wasn't peace he felt. It wasn't pride either. It was something quieter, like a river that had returned to its course after years of running dry. They had called him when everything else failed. Not for ceremony, not for a teaching position, but because someone remembered, in a moment of desperation, that there had once been a man who listened when machines spoke. And he had come, not for pay, not for redemption, just because it needed to be done. Outside the window, the clouds began to thin. The ocean expanded, opening up like a blank canvas. The sun, finally unshrouded, cast long ribbons of light across the water. The USS Vincennes was now only a gray speck, almost merged with the horizon, moving steadily toward its mission. Malcolm's fingers gently tapped the edge of the window, not nervously, but thoughtfully. He remembered the first time he boarded a Navy destroyer, the smell of salt and oil, the creak of metal underfoot. He had been young then, full of questions, full of faith in systems and ranks. He had believed in procedure, believed that truth always won out. It had taken years to unlearn that faith. It had taken this moment to restore it, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet resolve of doing what's right, even after the world has turned its back. There had been no apology when they forced him out all those years ago. Just a sealed envelope and a signature. No one asked what he had heard in the final moments before that engine failed. No one had cared that his maintenance logs had been altered by someone else to cover up a rush schedule. They needed someone to blame, and he had been convenient. But when the engine of the Vincennes cried out in a language only he could hear, the system, begrudgingly, remembered him. And when he came back, he didn't return with bitterness. He didn't arrive to scold or lecture. He arrived with a toolbox and a task. That's who Malcolm Reyes had always been. The helicopter banked slightly, shifting its course. Malcolm's eyes lingered one last time on the sea. He watched until even the speck of the destroyer was gone. Then he looked down, and the silence settled inside him, not heavy, but grounding. He closed his eyes briefly, allowing the hum of the blades to fill his ears, blending with the pulse of memory. In that silence, the brass rod in his toolbox rested like a baton at the end of a symphony. The performance was over. The music had played. The work had been done. Redemption wasn't about grand announcements or public ceremonies. It didn't need medals or promotions. For Malcolm, redemption lived in that brief moment when the engine roared cleanly, when the harmonic whine disappeared, when the rhythm fell into place. It lived in the return of trust, in himself, in his hands, in the sound of a well-aligned turbine turning exactly as it should. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. But something in his eyes, so often narrowed by years of suspicion and disappointment, had softened. A weight had lifted, quietly. A name had been reclaimed. A truth finally allowed to breathe. The last flight continued through the clearing skies. And Malcolm Reyes, the man forgotten for so long, watched the sea stretch endlessly before him, unchanged, untamed, and still full of stories for those who knew how to listen. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing stories coming your way. Drop your thought in the comments about what you feel of this story, and rate the story on a scale of 1 to 10.